Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Financial Issues Forum featuring Dr. Gregory Makoff speaking on his book, Default, the landmark court battle over Argentina's $100 billion debt restructuring. My name is Srish Chatterjee, Professor of Finance at the Gabili School of Business, and I serve as the Gabili Chair at Fordham University. On behalf of the Gabili School, a very warm welcome to all of you. For those who are joining us for the first time, let me mention that the Financial Issues Forum is a collaboration of three partners: the Museum of American Finance, the CFA Society of New York, and the Gabili Center for Global Security Analysis at Fordham. Our goal is to bring renowned experts from many different fields throughout the year to speak on topics and issues that are relevant to the economy, the market, and to you. In a few minutes, David Cowan, the CEO and president of the Museum of American Finance, will give a full introduction for our speaker, who will speak for about 40 minutes, at which point he will address questions submitted by you through the question field that is located below the video player. Please feel free to submit questions at any point during our event. We will be addressing as many of them as possible during the session. All attendees of today's event will be receiving digital copies of the book Default, with information coming to you following our event. And now over to my good friend, David Cowan.
Thanks, Suresh. Great to be back. Well, if history doesn't repeat itself, it certainly does rhyme with Argentina. Argentina has had 9 defaults since 1827, and it's been in the news for the last 2 decades on its most recent $100 billion default. Gregory Makoff is a great person to explain this saga. He's had a firsthand view of international debt and restructuring as an investment banker for Salomon Brothers and then Citigroup from the 1990s until about a decade ago. He's advised companies, institutions, and countries like Colombia and the Philippines on the very topic. Since 2015, he's been writing about sovereign debt as a senior fellow at both the Center of International Governance Innovation and the Mosavar Rahmani Center for Business and Government at Harvard's Kennedy School. He's also worked for the Treasury Department team that initially worked on the Puerto Rican debt crisis. Note that Gregory's background is a PhD in physics from the University of Chicago, so that must really come in handy when untangling the complexities that come with defaults. Now, the book has great appendices covering timelines, cast of characters, list of terms, and endnotes. How many endnotes? Well, 872 over 89 pages, so you know it's carefully researched and documented. But Gregory has really smartly put all of this at the end of the book, and it really reads like a novel with high drama that keeps building throughout. Maybe Gregory, though, got his inspiration on endnotes from a judge's ruling. He shares about how this particular judge had a 1,000-word footnote in a ruling that cited a quote about Argentina that seems most apropos. Quote unquote is the single most resistant debtor in international finance. How resistant? Let's find out. It's my pleasure to introduce Gregory Makoff on defaults.
Thank you, Suresh. Thank you, David. And thank you to the Museum of American Finance, the CFA Society, and the Gabelli Center for Global Securities Analysis. Today, we'll talk about a particular type of securities, sovereign bonds. But let's distinguish sovereign bonds from government bonds. Government bonds is a $100 trillion market approximately. We mean US Treasury bonds, Japanese government bonds, German government bonds, Chinese government bonds issued under their own law. When people say sovereign bond on Wall Street, they mean the bonds of developing countries issued under New York law or English law. We're usually talking about Mexico, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, Philippines. The problem with sovereign bonds is that nobody knows the recovery rate when sovereign bonds default. And they don't know the process of workout either. That's what we're talking about today in studying Argentina. This is very different than corporate bonds, where Chapter 7, Chapter 11 of the Bankruptcy Code are well known. And we also know rules of thumb for recovery of senior debt, 70%, 30% junior debt, stuff like that. In sovereign debt restructuring, there is no normal. Sometimes recoveries are way less than expected. Sometimes they're way above, which we will see. A fun fact, even the smartest experts in the field cannot tell you whether sovereign debt is enforceable in the courts of the United States. I'll explain that now. We'll talk about the Argentina case study in 5 parts, and we add some audio-visual elements, and I read from some transcripts, not just to make it more interesting, but it will let you understand more deeply the drama and the issues at hand. So part 1. Part 1 goes from December 2001 to June 2005. I call it the disputed deal. Argentina defaulted December 23-24, 2001, announcing a moratorium. Argentina was in a Great Depression, maybe worse than ours of the 1930s. Why Argentina defaulted is not the topic of my book, but let's listen to Argentina's lawyer, Jonathan Blackman, from Cleary Gottlieb, explain to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals in 2012 what the background to the default was. Now, this is 10 years later, and the courts are very tired of Argentina in court. And so this colloquy starts off with the judges saying, why would anybody ever want to buy a bond from Argentina? So let's listen to the first audio visual here. Jonathan Blackman from Cleary Gottlieb.
Holdout debt, it's $11.5 billion, but with interest and other unpaid debt, it's a lot more than that.
Mr. Blackman, can I ask you a question, sort of extra record?
Yeah.
Why would anyone lend money to Argentina with this sordid history?
In the past, you sound like Judge Cabranes footnote number 2.
I'm asking, why would anyone who can read ever lend money to Argentina?
Well, you asked the question about the coupon on this debt. It was at the time 11.5 or 12, which was a pretty hefty percentage.
The original bond?
Yeah. But in addition to that, people lend money. Argentina didn't default whimsically. There was a financial crisis in Argentina that was worse than the Great Depression. I mean, at the end of 2001, there was rioting in the streets. There were 4 presidents in the space of several weeks. The economy was so in the tank that kids were passing out in school from hunger. And I remember the first time I went down to Buenos Aires, it was like what you read about Weimar Germany. There were middle-class people in the street selling their possessions on street corners. That was the financial crisis. Okay, people lent money. These people didn't lend money at the time. These people bought in the secondary market at very steep discounts. Okay, but you asked the question. People lent money. Of course, they hoped to be paid back. They were warned in the disclosures that they were dealing with a sovereign, that if there was a default, there would be the Sovereign Immunities Act and other difficulties to collection. The sovereign.
So, Argentina is hurting. Argentina's ministers in 2001-2003, they are frustrated. Argentina, like all of Latin America, had a lost decade in the 1980s from that debt crisis. Most of them cleaned up their act in the 90s. Argentina was the star, supposedly, with the help of the IMF and World Bank reforming, but that program crashed and burned. And now the ministers are saying, we don't want to take your advice. We have our own plan. We want to run a big surplus, 3% a year of GDP primary surplus. Mind you, the US is -4 now, but let's not talk about that today. But part of their plan was a massive haircut on foreign creditors, 75%. A 75% haircut. Argentina lent $1 and wanted to pay creditors back 25 cents. creditors were shocked. They expected 3 times as much because in the Brady plans of the 1990s, they got much more. But Argentina was serious, and a huge fight between Argentina and the creditors ensued. Argentina stuck to its offer, but creditors organized into groups and attacked Argentina in the press, and they lobbied the IMF to force Argentina to pay nice. It was ugly, but Argentina won the battle. Many thought they wouldn't, but they had to raise the offer to 34 cents on the dollar and add a sweetener called a GDP warrant, where if the GDP growth grew above 3% a year and some other stuff, they'd pay billions more. And they did. They subsequently grew well and paid billions more. It was a complicated fight because the holder base, and it's good to explain that. Argentina had 152 different bonds under 7 currencies and 8 different laws. These bonds, it was 82 principal, 100 billion with past due interest restructured. There were institutional investors everywhere and over 500,000 retail investors. 450,000 retail moms and pops in Italy had bought these bonds. 14.5 billion. Why? Because the local banks sold it to them. Historically, US people put their money in CDs, they buy stocks, right? In Italy, they bought government bonds, Italian government bonds. In the 80s, 90s, it yields over 10%. Italy joins the euro, the yields go down to German yields of 3%. And the retirees go to their local bank and say, I want more yield. And they say, okay, you can buy Argentina or Russia. A third of Argentines are Italian. They also like Argentine football players. I'm not kidding you. They all bought the Argentine bonds for those sorts of reasons. And when Argentina defaulted, it was a human disaster in Italy, in Germany, in Japan, in many other places. So how did Argentina get its deal done? Threats, mega threats. It used verbal threats. The country said, if you don't take this deal, we will not pay you a penny. The country used contractual threats. It put a most favored nation clause in its bond deal saying they would blow up the deal. If any holdout creditor got a better deal, it had to pay it to everybody else, which meant it couldn't. And it used legal threats. It went to its own Congress and passed a law in 2005, deliberately to scare all those Italian investors, saying the executive branch is not allowed to pay a penny to holdouts. It's not allowed to make a second offer. And it can never pay court judgments up in New York, for example, even if they sue. And the Italian investors heard about that law. That's why it was passed. When the tally came in, Argentina got a 76% participation rate, and the holdout creditor group said it would be way less than 70. They were wrong. The Economist said Argentina talked tough and won. That ends the first part of the story, and it doesn't look very good for sovereign debt as an asset class. Argentina maybe taught the world, lowball your offers, sell deal on threats, and you can pay a lot less than 75 cents on the dollar. Part 2. So part 2 is catch and release. We go to court. Why? Because Argentina's 2005 deal was successful but suboptimal. 76% success meant 24% didn't take the offer. That was $20 billion of bonds. Their holders didn't take the deal, and most of them sued. What ensued was messy litigation. All over the world, but primarily in the Southern District of New York. Hundreds of lawsuits, dozens of attachment motions, dozens of appeals, almost 100 hearings, big plaintiffs, small plaintiffs, class action plaintiffs. The court was busy every day. It was uncoordinated, chaotic. litigation of the sort never ever seen in the world of sovereign debt. In the 90s, it would be one plaintiff, maybe two. This was completely unprecedented. And it tested sovereign debt enforceability for the first time in a true industrial strength. All these cases meant many rulings. It turns out it's very hard to attach from a foreign government because a federal statute called the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, originally passed in 1976. Just like the title says, it makes sovereign assets immune to attachment for the most part. This is a principle of international law that countries don't really want private creditors grabbing another country's stuff and causing diplomatic problems. And the end result is it's easy to sue foreign countries, but it's hard to collect. In the Argentina cases, prove it. Creditors try to attach airplanes, ships, bank accounts, bond accounts, central bank reserves, a satellite guidance system, all sorts of stuff, and it almost all fails. Why? Sovereign immunity. So why do you hear so much about attachment in the newspaper? Because procedurally, it's a game of catch and release. The plaintiff identifies an asset in the US. It has its lawyer go to a judge in an ex parte hearing. That's an emergency hearing, only the bondholders' counsel, and it asks for a temporary attachment ruling so the country can't take the asset out of the country. But that's only temporary. Argentina hears about it soon, the country, whatever country, and within 2 weeks, there is an open hearing in court. Both sides have presented briefs for or against attachment, and Argentina comes in arguing sovereign immunity. And virtually every time the judge looks at the asset and the conditions and looks at the briefs and the law and says, yep, I'm going to release it because you didn't meet the particularly high hurdle of attaching foreign assets under the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act. So it was catch and release again and again and again, all from 2005 to 2010. Now, there's one judge running all of this. He's getting mad. At first, though, in 2003, he was very sympathetic to Argentina. And when Argentines ask me, why was that meanie judge against us? I remind them of what he said in October 31st, 2003. When Argentina was suffering, Argentina needed to restructure its debt and creditors were in court complaining. He told them, quote, I have never heard of anything indicating that there is much of anything to recover on. What it could be is that the exchange offer looks better realistically than getting judgments and going around and trying to recover with very little result. I don't know the answer to that, but I also know that there are times that relatively low percentage of recovery is better than nothing. So you're going to hold out expecting that judge to help you later? That judge was Argentina's best friend. But by January 2006, after the 76% had accepted a deal voluntarily, the judge was getting irritable. During one of these catch and release sessions, he said when making a ruling for Argentina, he said, I regret to say that I do not think that the attachment can stand, but the law is the law. Now, at the end of 2006, we have a very articulate explanation of what the creditors were thinking. Why are they keep attaching when it's failing? So Judge Grisey was mystified why they kept trying, and he asked the plaintiff's lawyers to come to court and explain what they were doing since they kept failing. And now I'm going to read the transcript of Elliott Associates lawyer Robert Cohen from Deckert at a hearing on November 9th, 2006. This is as good a summary of the holdout theory of life you'll ever find. Elliott Associates is a fund run by Paul Singer that has been in business for 30 years. And a small part of its portfolio for years has been invested in sovereign debt. Some of it performs. In fact, most of the debt of Argentina, that NML, it bought before default, but sometimes default happens. For the last dozen years or so, I have represented NML or other Elliott affiliates in efforts to collect sovereign debt. We have never failed to collect on the sovereign debt. It's a long, hard battle. It's a battle that involves cooperation from the court in which the action is brought. It involves cooperation from courts overseas. It involves sometimes waiting for a change in administration in the country that's issued the debt so that attitudes change. Sometimes it involves the requirement of that country to come back into the capital markets in the US. And because the creditors are there and will interfere, they find it better to settle than to continue to resist. It's a long, hard fight. These judgments last for 20 years. And some of the creditors in this room are prepared to fight that battle. We will look for assets wherever we can find them. So now we're seeing some drama. Poor Argentina wanted a deep discount so it doesn't default again, and is using sovereign immunity as a shield to avoid paying the holdout creditors. Plaintiffs are saying, the holdouts, we're going to sue forever. And in the middle, you have this Judge Thomas P. Grisey getting ever annoyed. But at the end of this period, 2010, this catch and release period, Argentina makes a second offer. It goes to Congress, gets approval, reopens the offer on essentially the same terms, and 2/3 of the 20 billion capitulate. Most of these guys are not like Elliott. They don't want to wait 20 years, and they didn't know what they were getting into when they held out. So after this 2010 offer, September 2010, there were only 6.7 billion of holdouts left. So Argentina now has got 92% success rate at a historically deep haircut. Good for Argentina, but sovereign debt looks like a bad asset class. Part 3, injunctive relief. 3 weeks after Argentina's 2010 victory in bringing its success rate up to 92%, it was faced with a profound challenge. On October 20, 2010, lead plaintiff Elliott brings a motion suggesting a new mechanism to force Argentina to pay. And now the chaos is over. All the remaining plaintiffs know Elliott's doing it, and they're all stepping back and letting the master do the work. Attachment is failing, Elliott argues. Argentina is willfully ignoring the judgments of the court, it says. Something needs to be done. And what Elliott argues is that an injunction will do the job, a very creative injunction, one that Argentina can't thumb its nose at. Elliott's idea was this. Argentina had restructured 92% of its debt, and since 2001, it hadn't paid a penny on the 8%, but since 2005 and 10, it was paying the restructured debt in full. It had given those holders new bonds a smaller amount. So it wasn't very fair commercially for Argentina to pay in full some outstanding bonds and zero to a bunch of others. It was not treating creditors equally, and Argentina had a covenant in its bond requiring it to treat its foreign creditors equally. And to remedy that breach of covenant, Elliott asked for an injunction blocking Argentina's payments to the 92% to force it to pay the 8% in full, the percentage of them who were suing for that. The attraction, Elliott's lawyers explained, was that it could work. The hard thing about litigation against a South American country is that they are down there and we are up here. You can't force them to do anything. But the magic of this injunction is that all of Argentina's payments by contract pass through New York. Argentina's paying agent by bond contract went through the Bank of New York. And if the judge put an injunction on Argentina, the Bank of New York would be informed of it, and they are not going to process a payment in violation of a federal court order. So Argentina couldn't violate that order even if it wanted to. It was clever. It had some problems. But the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act and the Constitution does allow judges to impose injunctions. This is a strange part of the law most people haven't heard about. It's called equity. Equity is a little airy-fairy. It's about fairness. Usually we think about statute, but when statute doesn't work, then judges can go to equity. It's kind of a last resort. But the problem is under equity, it has to be a last resort, and it has to be equitable in light of its effect on third parties. Well, what do you think the 92% thought of this looming injunction? They do not like it, and they go to court. Here is the Second Circuit. This is David Boies, a super lawyer at the Second Circuit in 2013, arguing against the injunction on behalf of the 92%.
I understand the court's frustration here, all right? You've got Argentina and it hasn't paid its bonds, and there doesn't seem to be any way to get them to pay those bonds. And what the court is trying to find is it's trying to find how can we fashion an order that somehow makes them pay. And what I'm saying is that there are certain ways that you can do it. There are certain ways that the Congress has said you can't do it. But what the law, I suggest, in the Constitution is quite clear, is that you can't say to us, we're going to hold you hostage. We're going to say that you don't have a right to accept your lawfully negotiated contractual payments. Remember, Your Honor, these were bondholders that started off with the same kind of bonds. They exchanged them. And what, at the time of that exchange, which was sponsored not just by private parties, but governments, because it was important to get it done, what they took were these obligations. And both sides have agreed in the district court that we have an unconditional right to that payment. We have an unconditional right to that payment. The suggestion that somehow our right to that payment is conditioned on something else is nowhere in the record, and there's no evidence to that. The question is, can that unconditional right to be paid, for us to be paid, can that be broken? Can that be blocked? Can that be prevented? Even for a good purpose, and particularly done in a case in which we're not even a party.
Wow, this was amazing litigation to spend time with. Really, in my analysis, why the courts impose this injunction, despite these fundamental problems of fairness and breaking contracts, is they were so frustrated with Argentina. Now, I want to give you 3 examples, both the district court and the Second Circuit. In September 2011, you first had to rule on the contract breach before you got to the injunction. Judge Grisey is about to rule. Argentina at the time has $50 billion of reserves, and the particular case is asking for the injunction is less than $2 billion. So it's not a financial problem. And he turns to Argentina's lawyer and he says, okay, well, I might do this. How are you going to pay your judgments? And Argentina says there's no plan. We'll get around to it someday. Remember, we did that offer in 2005. We did that offer in 2010. Well, Judge Grisey, it's September 2011. He's asking to clean up the mess now. It was not a satisfactory answer. He did not want to waffle, so he turned around and made the ruling. He had the same kind of exchange in February 2012 before he imposed the injunction. And I'm going to read what he said about Argentina. He said, the thing is, the Republic has been in here for years saying no. Now you have done a pretty good job of it, but the no's are always to prevent the plaintiffs from recovering. Now, if there was any belief that the Republic would honestly pay its obligations, there wouldn't be any need for these kinds of paragraphs. The plaintiffs come in with difficult proposals, one after the other. Why? It isn't because they are interested in difficult legal problems. It's because your client, defended by your firm, persists in defying the court and in refusing deliberately to honor its obligations. I don't see any sign of Cleary Gottlieb helping to lead us out of this. I don't see any sign of the Republic helping to lead us out of this at all. That's Judge Grisey. At the Second Circuit, they had 2 hearings, 2 opinions. So after the first hearing, the first opinion, and the second hearing, they kind of had to impose the injunction, but they decided to write a letter to Argentina and said, we're going to do this, but do you have an alternative payment plan you can agree to? Because the one Judge Grisey approved required paying all the 8% in full, all the plaintiffs in the cases in full, if they pay anything to the 92%. Argentina's response was my way or the highway. They were not happy, and in the second opinion written by the Second Circuit, they labeled the country a uniquely recalcitrant debtor. And they affirmed Judge Grisey. So, where are we legally? Now plaintiffs have the upper hand. The world of sovereign debt is safe. The judges in the federal courts will go to great lengths to protect contracts against countries like Argentina. Part 4, fresh default. But there is a problem. In June 2014, when Argentina's appeals run out, the Supreme Court doesn't want to hear this nonsense. The situation depends on Argentina again. Argentina has a choice. It can capitulate and pay the holdouts in full in order to protect its credit rating and access to markets, in order to be able to pay the 92%, or it could default on everyone. The covenant in the bond said equal treatment. The courts demanded equal treatment. Well, they were going to get equal treatments, but there was pay everybody or pay no one. That would be a mess, wouldn't it? Wouldn't that be awful for a country to default on everyone? 2014, having gone in default in 2001 and go back into putting everyone into default. But Argentina did it. Why? And I think politics. Sovereign debt is about markets, it's about law, it's about economics, but it's also about politics. So we have a video here of the homecoming of the Fragata Libertad, an Argentine naval ship, a 3-masted ship that was grabbed in Ghana by Elliott. It goes around the world on state visits with a crew of 300, and Elliott got a court order, and it was catch and release. The Argentina, after it was arrested, went to the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea and got an order, and Ghana released it. That happened in October 2012. The release was January. The ship made it back to Argentina in January 2013. This was a huge political firestorm. A lot of we hate the vulture stuff going on in Argentina. A lot of we love our crew of the ship. So here's a video of the ship's return. The president in front of the ship at sunset with the cabinet, with the captain, and tens of thousands of supporters in the streets waving flags. This is the tail end of a 25-minute speech. And while you're watching it, it's in Spanish, but listen for the emotions and ask yourself, if you're this president, are you going to turn around 2 years later and capitulate and pay the holdouts in full?
No miento, no engaño, me interesa la patria, defiendo la bandera, quiero que la memoria de él, de mi compañero, quede bien en alto, y por eso voy a seguir luchando siempre, desde cualquier lugar, por el bienestar del pueblo, por la grandeza de la nación y por la felicidad de todos los argentinos. Gracias, muchas gracias por todo el aguante de estos 70 días. Muchas gracias a los integrantes de la fragata, gracias a sus familiares, gracias a todos los que acompañaron y pusieron garra y lo que hay que poner para defender a la patria. ¡Viva la patria! ¡Viva la patria! ¡Viva la patria! ¡Viva la Argentina! Gracias, muchas gracias.
Well, part 5, twist ending. Against expectations, and by a small margin, the opposition party wins in November 2015. President-elect Mauricio Macri promises to settle the litigation, but he sends 2 very experienced investment bankers, bond pros, up to New York to talk to the court. By that time, Judge Grisey had brought in a special master, a kind of intermediary in situations like this. Judge Grisey can't get involved with commercial terms. So he brought in this guy named Daniel Pollack, and the Argentines started complaining to him that Argentina is the victim here, not the victimizer. And what they focused on was, well, Argentina defaulted on 82 or so billion dollars of bonds. Then there was the 20 billion of past due interest. Of the 82, 300 million of the bonds were weird. They were, talk about security selection, this is the best ever. They found bonds, the 3 biggest plaintiffs, that had a weird derivative embedded, a credit derivative, so that the interest rate paid annually on the bond floated up if Argentina defaulted, or if its spreads in the market got worse. So after default, these bonds, their yield floated up to 101.5% a year. And these 3 plaintiffs had 300 million bonds and got judgments in 2009. And one of the clever things that clever hedge funds know under New York law, that the coupons keeps accruing and you get interest on interest until the date of your judgment. So they got 10 times par, 3 billion of judgments on 300 million of bonds. The math is simple. Par, 8 years of interest at 100, plus 1 more par because of interest on interest at the New York 9% rate. The Caputo and Basile, now the Minister of Finance and head of the Central Bank of Argentina under Milei, they said they're the victim, and then they did something else that was critical. Of the 10 billion or so claims left with accrued interest and judgments, they started cutting deals with the remaining Italian holders, a couple of the hedge funds, and they went back to the court and they said, would you please lift the injunction? Here are a couple bona fide deals I've set. And some of those deals, if someone had 10 times par, Argentina was willing to pay 7 times par. And the judge said, well, I'm really kind of tired of all of this, and you're being reasonable. You're no longer uniquely recalcitrant. I will lift the injunction. Now, since the remaining plaintiffs, like Elliott, know they have no chance of collecting under regular attachment, they are forced into basically the same deal. That's the end of the story. The big plaintiffs are forced into taking roughly a 25% haircut on their court claims. This is a fascinating twist ending, but what is sovereign debt as an asset class? Is it enforceable or is it not? The court helped the plaintiffs, but near the end it pulled it away to force a settlement. And the defining thing seems to be whether or not the country's acting like a uniquely recalcitrant debtor. So I can't tell you, and nobody knows, whether sovereign debt is really enforceable. It's interesting, it's mysterious, and it's a $1 trillion market. And most countries aren't defaulting, but when they do, nobody quite knows how fast it will be worked out, what process it will be worked out, or the recovery rates. I'd be pleased to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Gregory. That was simply fascinating. I had no idea about the complexity of this whole saga, and you give us such a rich case study to learn from. In fact, One of the comments from the audience, this is from a person by the name of Diego Jedge, who says, "This is epic." And he also has some questions. So let me start with the first question, which is, what books or resources do you recommend for learning to place bets against sovereign debt? The story of how savvy investors shorted Argentina's debt, briefly mentioned in the beginning of your book, is the reason for this question. This is from Diego.
Yeah, well, shorting is always dangerous because it's expensive. But I think that to get wise on sovereign debt, most of this is internal knowledge at hedge funds and law firms. I really broke it open with this book, but I think the best source to really understand the world is a podcast called Clauses and Controversies by Mark Wiedemeyer at UNC and Mitu Gulati at UVA now. And every week they're interviewing someone else from another country and another issue. And to make any bet, you have to get into the economics and the law and what is the IMF doing. There's no easy bet here. And it's a whole lifetime of investment to do it. I love the asset class, but it's one thing to bet against an asset or to buy a particular asset. It's another thing to just buy an index fund. There's some closed-end funds. So you can think of it more simply as a trillion-dollar market of developing countries with a higher yield than corporate bonds, or you can make a very focused hedge fundy type of bet.
Gregory, mucho gracias. Thank you. That was a great clip. I'm just curious, the actual dollar amount that Paul Singer and Elliott invested, do we know that? I know you mentioned he got back 74 cents on the dollar. What year did he invest? And how much did he spend on legal fees over the course? Do we have any idea on that?
You can't know what someone paid in the sense when a plaintiff sues, they have to tell the court in their declarations which bonds they bought and on what date. You can kind of back out what they bought for bonds, and you can kind of guess what they must have paid. But you don't know, did they buy some other bonds and sell them? Did they have a short? Did they have a CDS? Did they buy GDP warrants and hedge them against something else? You can never know what a hedge fund won or lost. I have no doubt there was, in addition to 75% of the dollar, the big four funds that sued and settled together, it got $200 million to settle a bunch of other stuff, including legal fees. I don't think that was all legal fees because there was some other attachment stuff that was cleaned up with it, but that or half that amount, I don't know. There was also a lot of lobbying stuff I talk about in the book where they spend tens of millions on that. But if you're going to sue, it's going to take years. It's going to be millions of dollars of legal expenses. Not many people are equipped for that time horizon and that specialty.
Thank you. Here's a question from Jack Robano. Do you have any comment on potential outcomes for the ongoing Argentine litigation with Burford?
Just my personal opinion. No investment advice here, because Burford's a traded equity, is Argentina has no money. Now, when Elliott brought pari passu, there were $50 billion in the central bank. As of January, Argentina's central bank was negative. Also, Elliott had bond claims and waivers of sovereign immunity. The Burford claim is a kind of local law obligation with no sovereign immunity, so it's harder to attach. They have a judgment, but Argentina has no money. As we've seen in this case, there was a settlement at a discount. So having watched this other story, there's going to have to be a settlement. It always ends in a settlement, and I don't think it can be very big because Argentina can't pay a lot. You want 3% bonds that pay off over 100 years? I don't know what the number is, but it's not going to be. I don't see practically, economically, how it can be anything like the face value. But this is a mystery watch this space. Nobody knows what's going to happen.
So you mentioned credit default swaps. We don't know. Effie Zachary's asking if someone has a credit default swap, what is considered then to be an official default in cases similar to this?
I'm not the ultimate pro on it, but the ISDA has a committee of people to discuss if something's a default or not a default. And usually I think if a country has published a moratorium, that's an event of default. If a country has missed a payment, that's an event of default. But then there's some ambiguous, weird situations where the committees fight about it. And there it's always a little murky.
Thank you. I have a question here from my colleague in the business school, Professor Chidambaran. He is asking, in hindsight, what is the net effect of this case on the sovereign debt market?
That's a great question, but it's a surprise answer. Because throughout the book, I track what policymakers are doing. And policymakers, this holdout creditor problem didn't exist in the 80s and 90s. Why does it show up in 2001? Because in the 80s and 90s, banks like Citibank and Chase and JP Morgan and Deutsche Bank and Lloyds of London lent all the money. And they were a club, a small club of big banks and a wider club of a couple hundred smaller banks. And when they decided to help a country, they forced each other in. There was no gamesmanship. But when it went to bonds, small investor fund says, I don't care, I'll let everybody else take the pain, I'll get paid in full. And so about the time Argentina default, the IMF said, we have a problem here with bonds. The market is too numerous, anonymous, and hard to coordinate. So let's have a sovereign debt court. And the market didn't like it. US Treasury said, let's put voting clauses in bonds so that if one bond, 75% of the holders agree to a deal, 100% are bound. And since Elliott in Peru bought 2% of the whole lot, then they couldn't have done it. And so that was a solution, but it didn't quite work well, because if a country like Greece had 30 different bonds, holdout creditors could buy 26% of 5 of the bonds, so that voting didn't work. So after Argentina's redefault in 2014, policymakers proposed and the market accepted, if a country has 30 different bonds, they all vote together, 75% up or down. Makes it really, really hard to hold out, totally changes the math of it. It puts Elliott's out of business. So Argentina very oddly changed the world, not by the legal opinions, because the chaos scared the market into accepting something it really didn't want, which was voting clauses to make it easier to default in an orderly way. 100 years from now, I bet they're still using these clauses in bonds. And when a young investor, young law student says, why do we have these funny clauses in sovereign bonds that are very different than corporate bonds? Someone says, oh, those messy Argentina cases. I think there's a book about it in the library.
We know that book. Alex asks, Argentina is one of the very few issuers of warrants. What are the prospects of using this instrument more often to facilitate restructuring and the uncertain outcomes? And what are the other alternatives to address the uncertain outcomes practically possible?
Warrants are an opportunity and a problem, in that economically, a lot of economists love warrants. The problem is, a falling market, a collapsing company, a chaotic industry, it's so hard to predict the direction of the industry and the value of a security. Imagine trying to model a country's economic growth and its fiscal. That's what the IMF tries to do. It's impossible. So when a country restructures with the IMF and tells creditors they need a 40% haircut, the creditors say, well, what if growth is higher and it only has to be a 30% haircut? And inevitably, the IMF and the country say, well, we trust our model. We don't want to pay more. And so there you get to the solution. Well, let's invent a GDP warrant so you have the bigger haircut, but if things go better than expected, you give some money back. It's an instrument that covers model uncertainty. But they're complex instruments, and while Argentina's instrument worked well, it also was too complicated and has led to that other litigation. You had the $16 billion judgment on the Burford related to its YPF nationalization, and you have a $1.5 billion judgment in the English court because Argentina didn't make a payment on some small amount of warrants that some hedge funds, who also sued on the bonds, says, oh, you owe me a little bit of money. And so the complexity of the instruments is a problem. So I'm in favor of them. If simple, they will always be around. They're frequently used. A good question.
Here's a question from Diego. This goes back into another incident in history. Question is, any opinion of the recoverability of the Mississippi Planters Bank bonds and Mississippi Union bonds? What developments would you look for when analyzing that situation?
Oh boy, Diego has got to listen to Clauses in Controversy. They have whole episodes on stories like this. They had one last year on old Chinese bonds from 100 years ago. So I can't speak to any particular bond because you literally have to be a law professor and spend months investigating these things. And usually there's some reason it timed out. Statute of limitations, some contractual prescription period that says this is worth nothing after 60 years. But sometimes it might be worth something and you can go harass the party until they pay you. So good luck. There's a world of fun if you go look over at that podcast.
You know, in the museum's collection, we have some of these Chinese railway bonds, you know, from before the communists took over. It'd be wonderful if they ever paid off to help our museum's endowment. One last question from me. I'm just wondering, of all the characters you came across in this book, does anybody stand out, or any particular anecdote that jumped out at you or surprised you, or a story that you wanted to relay, or a person?
Oh gosh, that's such a great question. I've thought about this a lot. You know, the book is about Judge Grisey. He's a very sad character. He's very healthy at the peak of his skills at the beginning, and he's wrecked at the end. He's hard of hearing. He's basically relying on this special master to do everything. And he has an unsolvable problem because we don't have a bankruptcy law for sovereigns. They can't file, so the litigation goes on and on. There's no aggregated voting. In bankruptcy, with 2/3, you're done. But here, Argentina had 76%, then it had 92%. Even when it had 99% sign up, there was another 1% say, no, I want a better deal. So it was going to go on forever. And the book is really a study of why did he make this ruling? Look, there's Anne Kruger, there's the appellate counsel for Elliott is Theodore Olson of Bush versus Gore fame. If you thought David Boies was good, I mean, Ted Olson is amazing. And so, but if I have to pick one, it's Judge Grisey, and it's hard to be a judge. And especially on partisan issues these days, everybody is at the extremes. Everybody has a single truth they want to win, and his job is to get a settlement. And so I think it's very educational in trying to understand how judges think rather than just was the ruling right or wrong.
I want to follow up on David's question a bit, and because you also mentioned Anne Kruger. In the book, you start by talking about how she was, speaking, addressing the need to find a sort of process for sovereign debt default and bankruptcy, and so where are we on that? Is there anything you can tell us about how much progress has been made?
Well, the question is the objective bankruptcy or quasi-bankruptcy? Because these voting clauses, when you think of bankruptcy as a bankruptcy professor, you have a judge, you have a bankruptcy court with equitable powers, and you have a litigation stay. You have DIP financing to finance the company during the process. You have a plan of adjustment of the company. You have classes of creditors, votes of classes of creditors, and you have cram down. Now, with these 2014 majority voting clauses, you have a very powerful voting clause. And if there's a suit brought, you have a judge already. And honestly, the IMF does DIP lending. You can't attach IMF payments. So what's only really missing in our informal quasi system is an actual litigation stay. So there are still proponents for a sovereign bankruptcy, but when Anne Kruger proposed it, it was rejected as impractical, and the Treasury promoted the voting clauses. And so it died politically. Now, Professor David Skeel from Penn, who's a scholar of bankruptcy, wrote a beautiful book called Debt's Dominion, where he explains we had the power of Congress to write a bankruptcy law, but they didn't write a lasting one until around 1896. 100 years, we had a law, we canceled the law, until there was a 10-year negotiation balancing debtor and creditor rights, did we get a workable law like the one we have today. So I would say life started in 2001 with Argentina's default, and it might take us 100 years to figure this out. The voting clauses are the first piece, but there should be some continual evolution, whether it ends up in 30, 40 years with an actual international treaty. I don't know. But Argentina defaulted in 2020 in COVID, so did Ecuador. Guess what? They used the new clauses. They got 100% in. There was no litigation. There were no holdouts because they used the clauses to force the holdouts in. It's looking from the market experience like a problem solved in the bigger cases.
How are we doing on time, David?
It's time to wrap it up. What a great hour. Thanks, Greg.
All right. Then thank you, Greg, once again for a wonderful tutorial on such a fascinating topic. And I'm now going to read through all the footnotes that David talked about at the very end.
End notes. They weren't
endnotes at the very end. Yes, right. and thank you, David, and thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Please join us again next Tuesday, March 19th, for a talk by Mark Higgins on learning from financial history, how to learn from the past to predict the future. So with that,
bye, everyone.
We'll close for today.